Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Horror Stories. I know many of you use these episodes to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Story 1. I was living alone in an apartment in Fort Collins, Colorado. I was 24 at the time and had just started dating a girl named Alyssa, whom I met through a mutual friend at a local coffee shop. She was sweet, quiet, and had an enigmatic, almost hypnotic charm. Everything started off quite normally. We saw each other often, watched movies together, went hiking in the hills, all the typical early relationship things. But after a few months, I began to notice strange things. Alyssa was always very secretive about her past. She was reluctant to introduce me to her friends or family, claiming she no longer kept in touch with them. At first, I didn't think much of it. I assumed maybe she had family issues or delicate situations she didn't want to talk about. I respected her privacy and didn't push, at least not for a while. But slowly, her behavior began to unsettle me. Sometimes I'd catch her staring at me when she thought I wasn't looking, with an intense expression that was hard to read. I used to joke about it and brush it off, but something about her gaze left me uneasy. Then she started showing up at my apartment unannounced even in the middle of the night. Sometimes I'd find her sitting in her car outside, just waiting in silence until I noticed her. When I asked why she didn't call or text before coming over, she would just shrug and say she liked surprising me. But these surprises weren't pleasant. They were deeply unsettling. I remember one night in particular when I woke up around 3 a.m. I couldn't sleep, so I got up to get a glass of water. As I passed the living room window, something caught my eye. Alyssa's car was parked across the street, lights off, engine off, completely silent. I squinted into the darkness and barely made out her silhouette behind the wheel, staring directly at my window. A chill ran through me. My gut screamed that something was wrong, but once again, I told myself she was probably just overly attached. I went back to bed, telling myself I'd talk to her the next day about setting some boundaries. The following afternoon, when I casually brought it up, she didn't seem fazed. In fact, she looked mildly amused by my comment. She simply said she missed me, and once again, I let it go. Even though I was feeling increasingly uncomfortable, things escalated quickly after that. A week later, I came home from work to find her sitting on the steps outside my apartment door. She looked tense and anxious. Before I could ask what she was doing there, she jumped up and told me I had to come with her immediately. She insisted it was something important but wouldn't explain. She just hurried me toward her car parked at the curb. Every instinct in my body screamed not to get in that car. I felt confused. Alyssa had never acted so desperate before. Still, something inside me told me I shouldn't go. When I firmly said I wouldn't go anywhere until she explained what was going on, her face changed. The anxiety turned into a quiet fury. Without another word, she turned and walked away quickly, got into her car, and drove off at high speed without looking back. I stood there frozen, confused and scared. I went inside, locked the door, and spent the rest of the night trying to make sense of what had just happened. After that strange encounter, I finally accepted that I needed to distance myself from Alyssa. But before I could talk to her about it, I received a disturbing message from an unknown number 2 days later. The text simply said, "Stay away from Alyssa. She's not who you think she is." I felt a cold shiver run through me. My heart pounded as I immediately replied, asking who it was. But I never got a response. Growing more anxious, I tried calling Alyssa, but her phone went straight to voicemail. That night, I couldn't sleep from the anxiety. Around 2 a.m., I was still in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling an unbearable sense of unease. That's when I heard soft footsteps approaching the door of my apartment. I froze. All my senses were on high alert. I heard someone quietly testing the doorknob, as if trying to open it. When they realized it was locked, the footsteps faded away just as softly. I carefully approached the window and gently parted the blinds, just in time to see Alyssa hurrying into a car parked a block away. 2 other people were waiting in the vehicle. A deep chill spread through me. The next day, completely shaken, I set out to find answers on my own. I dove into the internet and started reviewing her social media profiles, something I had never done thoroughly before. At first glance, everything looked normal. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But as I dug deeper and searched her name more thoroughly, I found something disturbing. I came across an old news article published in Nebraska 2 years earlier. And there it was, the bombshell. Alyssa wasn't her real name. Her name was Leah. The article detailed the takedown of a kidnapping ring operating in the Omaha area, one that used women as bait to lure young adults into vehicles. There was a photo of Leah in the article. It was her without a doubt, though her hair color and style were different now. She had been arrested along with other suspects but released due to lack of evidence. Since then, the report said the group had relocated, and Leah, or Alyssa as she now called herself, had moved to Colorado. I was gripped by icy terror as I realized how close I had come to becoming another victim. Panic overtook me. Without thinking twice, I called the Fort Collins police and told them everything I had found. They took note of my report and promised to investigate. They advised me to take extra precautions, keep all doors and windows locked, and most importantly, not to have any further contact with her. Over the following days, I could barely sleep. I was constantly peeking through the window, feeling unsafe even in my own home. I didn't see Alyssa or her car again, and over time my anxiety began to fade, though only slightly. But just when I started to think it was all over, I received another message. This time it came from a different number. "You shouldn't have talked to the police, big mistake." My stomach turned. That same night I threw some clothes into a bag and rushed to a friend's house in Loveland. I couldn't bear to spend another night alone in that apartment. Even there, I couldn't feel at ease. Every time a car's headlights passed by the window, I froze, convinced they had found me. I never had direct contact with Alyssa again, but months later I read another news report. This time it was local, out of Fort Collins. 3 people had been arrested for attempting to kidnap a college student. Leah's name and photo appeared again, alongside 2 men I didn't recognize. They had tried to snatch someone not far from where I used to live, but a witness intervened in time, and the police arrived before they could get away. The most terrifying part came from the police report. When they checked the suspects' phones, they found pictures of several people marked as targets, complete with addresses and personal information. My name was on that list. They had been planning this for weeks. Not long after reading that article, I decided to leave Colorado. I needed a fresh start somewhere far away. I moved to a small town in Idaho looking for peace. But even now, a year later, I still double-check that every lock is secure. And when I walk alone at night, I can't help but constantly look over my shoulder. I question the intentions of every new person I meet, and I never fully trust anyone. Because even though Leah, or Alyssa, or whatever her name really is behind bars, the fear of knowing how close I came to disappearing without a trace has never gone away. Story 2. This happened to my mother when she was 19 years old. At the time, she was working in a small office that offered PCO and STD phone services, a tiny place that didn't require many employees. Her boss had his main office right next door, connected to the PCO space, where several people worked, since his main business was in real estate. My mom usually worked alone and had started that job during her university vacation. Her shift began in the morning and ended around 5 or 6 in the evening. One day, while she was in the office, a man walked in who appeared to be about 50 years old. His hair and beard were completely white, and he wore a navy blue shirt. The place had a glass front, allowing visibility from both inside and out. The man came in to make a call from the PCO. After hanging up, he walked over to the desk where my mother was seated and struck up some light conversation. He asked if she was related to the boss, and when she said no, he began complimenting her, saying she was very beautiful and looked like an educated young woman. He then commented that he didn't understand why she was working in such a small place, that with her looks and education, he could easily help her get a job at a well-known bank nearby since he had some contacts there. He formally introduced himself and asked her to bring her resume to his home so they could talk more in detail about her studies and job options. My mother felt a little uncomfortable with the idea of going to his house, but the man mentioned he lived with his sick father and that a servant helped him take care of both the home and the elderly man. He also claimed to live right across the street, in a relatively new building where upper-class people resided. Trusting what he said, my mother agreed to visit him after finishing her workday. Before leaving, the man gave her his phone number and asked her not to mention their conversation to anyone in the office. This seemed reasonable to her, as she didn't want her boss to think she was planning to quit. That afternoon, after her shift ended, my mother crossed the street and entered the complex where the man claimed to live. She saw him standing with a middle-aged woman and two school-uniformed children, likely just back from school. At first, she wasn't sure it was the same man, as his hair and beard were now dyed black, and he wore a t-shirt. However, when he saw her, he waved. The man introduced my mother to the woman. Their interaction was so natural and friendly that my mother assumed the woman was his wife and the children were his. They all walked toward the building, and the man asked my mother to follow them. They took the elevator together, and while he pressed the button for his floor, my mom didn't pay attention to which button the woman pressed. When the elevator stopped on the 4th or 5th floor, the woman and the kids got out. My mother thought they all lived there and started to step out too, but the woman laughed softly and told her that wasn't her floor. The man remained in the elevator, and at that moment my mother realized the woman was not his wife, so she stepped back inside. As they continued riding up, the man told her he worked in Dubai and spent most of his time outside the country. They finally arrived on the 9th floor where he lived. The man exited first and my mother followed. The hallway was square-shaped and 2 or 3 kids were playing there. There were 2 doors on each side, and in the middle, the elevator next to the stairwell. The man walked toward the door closest to the elevator, unlocked it with a key, and invited my mother inside. She noticed the kids were still playing in the hallway. Once inside, she saw the living room was neat, with white walls, an L-shaped sofa, a TV, a teapot, a soda bottle, and a box of hair dye with a brush, as if he had just finished dyeing his hair. The man asked if she minded if he closed the door. My mother, trying to remain polite but cautious, asked him to leave it open. He agreed. Then he offered to show her the apartment before discussing the job. She agreed, and he led her through a door next to the sofa into a small hallway. My mother noticed that all the lights in the apartment were off, except the one in the living room. The man opened a door to the left and said, "This is the bedroom." She looked inside and saw a dark room with closed windows and a bed. But something made her shiver. In front of the bed, there was a tripod that appeared to hold a camera. She didn't see the father or the servant he had mentioned. When she asked about them, he said they had both gone to the doctor. That struck her as very suspicious. If he knew they wouldn't be home, why had he told her otherwise? With fear growing inside her, she suggested they return to the living room and talk about the job right away. He agreed, and she walked ahead to end the tour. The man brought a chair from another room and sat across from her. He offered her a cold drink that was inside the teapot. My mother declined, but he insisted and went to the kitchen with the soda bottle, all while making small talk about whether she liked the apartment. He returned with 2 glasses and offered the drink again. She took the glass but didn't drink it. He asked her to take a sip, and she said she would later, but she never did. After insisting with the drink, the man started talking again about his job in Dubai, claiming he lived in a much larger apartment there. He mentioned how strict the laws were in that country, but my mother was barely listening. She was too busy processing everything she had seen and the deepening feeling of discomfort growing stronger by the second. Then suddenly, while speaking about Dubai, the man grabbed her hand without warning. He did it as part of a strange explanation about how thieves in that country were punished by having their hands cut off. That unexpected physical contact terrified her. In that moment, she understood with complete clarity that she was in danger. Silently, she began to pray, desperately hoping for a way out. The man walked over to the door, still talking about his apartment in Dubai and its automatic locking system. My mother wanted to leave immediately, but he stood close to the door, as if he were waiting for the right moment to lock it in case she tried to escape. And the children playing outside wouldn't notice anything. They were just kids, distracted and unaware of what might be happening behind that door. That's when something unexpected happened. 2 doors on the opposite side of the hallway opened almost simultaneously. 2 women, likely the mothers of the kids still playing, came out. They called for their children and after seeing each other, began chatting in the hallway, right outside the man's door. That was the opportunity my mother had been praying for. The sudden interruption caught him completely off guard, and maybe the women even saw her. My mom acted quickly. She stood up confidently and said, "It's getting late. I have to get home or my mom's going to kill me." She didn't wait for the elevator. She headed straight for the stairs and started going down as fast as she could. The man tried to stop her, but keeping calm, she promised she'd see him the next day. A lie she only told to prevent him from chasing after her. She managed to get out of the building and arrive home safe. Once home, she decided not to tell anyone what had happened. She didn't want to cause any problems or make a scene. But the next day, she was scared to return to work. Her boss, who usually stayed locked up in his office all day, came out unexpectedly and approached her. He asked her directly if she had spoken with the man from the previous day. My mother, surprised, said yes. Then he asked whether the man had crossed any lines or done anything inappropriate. She told him no. After asking a few more questions, the boss was clear. "Don't go near that man again. He's not a good person. Don't go to his house." Still confused, my mom promised she would avoid him. To this day, she never found out how her boss knew about the encounter or whether he knew the man personally. That day passed without further incident, but while she was walking home after her shift ended, she saw the man. He was standing in front of the building where he claimed to live, as if he had been waiting for her. She managed to avoid him, but he saw her. Since he wasn't quick enough to reach her, he sent his servant to stop her. The servant approached her, trying to convince her to speak with his boss one more time. My mom firmly refused and got into a taxi, managing to get away. Since her vacation was almost over, she decided to quit that job shortly after. A few years passed after that terrifying encounter. My mother had left that job behind and moved on with her life. But one day, while flipping through the newspaper, she came across a story that sent a chill down her spine. A man around 60 years old had been arrested in another city for drugging and sexually assaulting a young woman. The article also stated that the man had a history of similar crimes. Among his methods was secretly recording his victims to later blackmail them with the footage. When my mother saw the photo of the man who had been arrested, she felt as if the world stopped. It was the same man, the one who had invited her to his home under false promises of a job, the one who had dyed his hair to appear younger, the one who insisted she drink from a glass, the one who turned off every light in the apartment except the one in the living room, the one who touched her without reason while talking about punishments in Dubai. It was him. Realizing that this man had continued the same pattern with other women made her sick to her stomach. The most terrifying part was that, according to the article, all of his victims were around the same age my mother had been when it happened to her, young women in their early 20s. The news left her frozen. She didn't tell anyone at the time. She kept the memory, the fear, and the guilt of having trusted him, until many years later, when she was already married to my father. She shared this story with me just last year. She still tells it with a mixture of fear, relief, and deep gratitude. Gratitude for the women who walked out of their apartments at the exact right moment. Gratitude because unknowingly they prevented her story from ending in tragedy. Before we move on to the next story, if it's your first time on our podcast, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss any of our suspenseful tales. Your support means the world to us, so please share these stories with your friends and family. Thank you for joining us. Story 3. This story happened to my sister Jessica and me 20 years ago, and I'm only telling it now because she recently passed away, so I'm sharing this in her memory. 2 years after my parents divorced, I finally made the decision to leave my mother's house and move in with my father and sister in a rural area in southern Maine. My father owned a large piece of property surrounded by dense forest. The house itself was a 2-story building with a basement, attic, and a beautiful wraparound porch. Despite its size and charm, the house had been designed specifically for my stepmother, a deeply unpleasant person who tormented us throughout our childhood, mostly through psychological cruelty and occasional physical punishment. For many years, visits to that house were filled with anxiety and dread. Thankfully, my father divorced my stepmother during my junior year of high school. My sister immediately chose to move in with him after the separation, while I decided to wait until graduation before joining them. At first, I thought the absence of my stepmother would make the house feel different, but I quickly realized that something was still very wrong there. My bedroom was located right next to my sister's room on the second floor. From her room, there was access to the attic, a dark, unfinished space we rarely entered. Not long after I moved in, we started to hear strange noises coming from up there at night. At first, it sounded like small, rapid footsteps scurrying across the attic floor. My sister and I would nervously joke that it was elves, brushing off the strange sounds with imaginary explanations. When we mentioned it to our father, he dismissed our concerns, saying it was probably just rats or squirrels. However, as the weeks passed, the activity grew more frequent and more unsettling. It started with footsteps, but then doors around the house began opening on their own for no apparent reason. There were nights when I would be reading or watching TV in the living room and suddenly hear a soft creak, followed by the slow groan of a door opening upstairs. Each time I checked, I found nothing but an empty hallway, with no logical explanation for the open doors, when one night in particular was burned into my memory. My sister and I were watching TV downstairs around midnight. She yawned and decided to go to bed while I stayed up a little longer, caught up in a late-night show. About 10 minutes after she went upstairs, I clearly heard footsteps slowly descending the staircase. Assuming my sister had forgotten something, I didn't think much of it, until I heard the basement door creak open. Confused, I got up and walked toward the hallway. I stood at the top of the basement stairs and called out, asking if she needed anything. The only response I got was silence. My heart started pounding as I quickly flipped on the basement light. The stairs lit up, but no one was there. Now very nervous, I closed the basement door quickly and made sure it was locked. Feeling unsettled, I decided it was best to go upstairs and try to get some sleep. My door had always been a bit tricky. It didn't fit the frame quite right and needed to be forced shut. That night, I made sure to push it firmly closed before getting into bed. I left the window slightly open to let in the cool night breeze, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. Sometime after 1 a.m., I woke up abruptly to the sound of footsteps, this time louder and quicker, coming up the wooden stairs. I lay frozen, listening as they moved down the hallway toward my sister's room. Her door opened slowly with a loud creak, then slammed shut seconds later. My heart felt like it was going to explode as a wave of terror swept over me. Suddenly, the footsteps rushed toward my room, and to my horror, something or someone slammed violently against my door, shaking it hard in its frame. Terrified, I jumped out of bed, standing frozen and breathless with panic. The steps quickly retreated toward my sister's room, and I clearly heard the attic door fling open, followed by fast footsteps climbing upward. Eyes wide with fear, I listened to the rapid movement across the attic above me, heading toward the small window that opened onto the porch roof. Then came a heavy thud from outside, like someone had jumped onto the porch roof with force. Shaking, I rushed to my window, slammed it shut, and locked it. Peering desperately into the darkness, I saw nothing, just the eerie glow of the moon reflecting off the porch shingles. Seconds later, I heard my sister's trembling voice from outside my door. "Are you trying to scare me?" she asked anxiously. I quickly opened my door, relieved to see her there, though she was clearly frightened. "No, are you the one scaring me?" I replied with a shaky voice. She shook her head and explained that the loud banging on my door had woken her up. Then she heard both her bedroom door and the attic door open quickly, followed by someone running. Terrified, she had stayed hidden under her blankets until everything went quiet again. Neither of us slept that night. We sat together on my bed, wide awake, waiting for daylight. The next morning, we confronted our dad, but once again he dismissed our fears, insisting it was just animals or normal old house noises. Frustrated but determined, we installed a sturdy lock on the attic door. From that night on, we also locked our bedroom doors every night, and I stopped leaving my window open after dark. After that terrifying night, the activity gradually lessened. Occasionally, we still heard strange creaks or light footsteps in the attic, but nothing as violent or frightening ever happened again. Still, there was always an unsettling feeling that lingered, reminding us of what we had experienced. Both of us felt constantly watched whenever we were home alone, especially after nightfall. About a year later, our father announced he had decided to sell the house. My sister and I couldn't have been happier. Although we loved the size and space of the property, neither of us ever felt safe there again. Eventually, a young family bought the house, apparently unaware of its strange history. We packed up quickly, relieved to be moving on and starting fresh somewhere else. Our new home, smaller and closer to town, was peaceful from the very beginning. Nothing strange ever happened there, and slowly life returned to normal. Years later, out of curiosity, I mentioned our experiences to a neighbor who had lived nearby for decades. After hesitating for a moment, she told me that before my father bought the land, it had been home to a troubled, lonely old woman whose mysterious death sparked ghost rumors in the area. Even now, those memories still give me chills when I think about that night. My sister and I rarely talked about it, preferring to leave it buried in the past. Story 4. I started babysitting for the Morales family in Denver, Colorado in February of 2020. At the time, I was also working part-time as an administrative assistant at a small logistics company in Lakewood. My boss, Mark, was genuinely one of the kindest people I had ever worked for. He always let me leave early if I needed to run errands, never questioned my breaks, and even surprised me with coffee some mornings. It was one of those rare workplaces where you truly felt appreciated, which I was deeply grateful for after having had some stressful jobs in the past. Because Mark was so understanding with flexible scheduling, I decided to take on a second job as a babysitter, thinking the extra income would help me pay down some of my student loan debt. That's how I ended up working for Mr. Morales a few nights a week. Jonathan Morales was a single father. His wife had passed away a year earlier in a car accident, leaving him alone with his little daughter Bella, who was 4 years old. He worked long hours at a tech company downtown and needed someone he could trust to care for Bella when he had to work late. Bella was a bright and curious little girl who adored coloring books and her stuffed animals. She had an impressive vocabulary for her age and was always asking questions about anything that caught her interest. Every time I arrived, she'd run up to me smiling, eager to show me her latest drawing or ask if we could bake cookies. On this particular night, if I remember correctly, it was March 4th. Jonathan had a major project at work. He apologized as he rushed out around 6 p.m., saying he probably wouldn't be back until after midnight. I assured him not to worry. I'd take care of dinner and get Bella to bed on time. We spent the evening as usual, coloring animals, building block towers, and watching a short children's show before bedtime. I noticed Bella was especially affectionate that night, climbing into my lap and asking for lots of hugs. I figured she probably missed her dad, or maybe even her mom, though she didn't talk about her often. Around 8:30, after giving her a bath, I took Bella to her bedroom, which was decorated with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. She was yawning nonstop, so I tucked her into bed, read her a short story, and wished her good night. About half an hour later, I was in the living room flipping through channels when I heard Bella calling me from upstairs. I put down the remote and went to check on her. She was standing by the window pointing outside. "Bella, what's wrong?" I asked softly. She looked at me with a worried expression and said in a trembling voice, "There was a man outside looking at me through the window." I tried to reassure her. "Sweetie, there's nobody out there," I said, giving a quick glance outside. The yard was dimly lit by a motion-activated light, and I didn't see anything. We were in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood with well-kept gardens, not the kind of place where people usually wandered around. Bella still seemed scared, so I walked her back to bed and reminded her it was time to sleep. She insisted I close the curtains completely, and once I did, she finally lay down. I went back downstairs feeling a little uneasy. Less than 15 minutes later, I heard Bella crying upstairs, but it wasn't a typical cry. It was urgent, full of fear. My heart pounded as I raced up the stairs, nearly tripping on the last step. I found Bella sitting in bed, sobbing uncontrollably. Between sobs, she managed to say, "He came back. He's looking at me again." I looked toward the window. Even though the curtains were drawn, there was a small gap through which you could peek outside. Everything looked dark and still, but my hands were already shaking from nerves. If she was this scared, something must have disturbed her. I held her close, calming her down, and laid her back into bed. In a mix of worry and defiance, I decided to check around the outside of the house. If someone was out there, I wanted them gone. I grabbed a kitchen knife. It may have been overkill, but in that moment it felt necessary. I stepped out the back door into the cold, watching my breath turn to white mist. The yard was quiet, surrounded by a tall fence. The motion light turned on, revealing only some scattered toys in the grass and tree branches gently swaying in the breeze. I carefully checked around the house, the windows, the driveway, even behind the trash bins, but I found nothing. Relieved but still uneasy, I returned inside and locked the back door. Just as I turned the deadbolt, I heard someone violently shaking the front door, like they were trying to force it open. My heart skipped a beat, and I ran to the living room to look through the peephole. There he was, a tall man probably in his 40s, wearing dirty pants and a stained hoodie. His hair was messy, and his eyes had a wild, frantic look that sent chills down my spine. He began pounding hard on the door. I yelled that I would call the police if he didn't leave immediately, but that only made him try harder to get in. With trembling hands, I quickly dialed 911. As I explained the situation to the operator, my voice shaking, the man heard me say "police" and bolted. A few long minutes later, though it felt like forever, patrol cars arrived. The officers searched the area and found the man crouched behind some bushes near the fence. After arresting him, one of the officers told me something that chilled me to the bone. The man had escaped earlier that day from a nearby psychiatric facility and was considered dangerous due to his unpredictable behavior, although he had never used weapons. Jonathan arrived shortly after, visibly distressed and apologizing for leaving us alone. Bella eventually fell asleep in her dad's room, cuddled with a stuffed animal. I, on the other hand, have never been able to forget the image of that man at the window, and to this day I still get chills when I think about that night. The worst part is not knowing why he fixated on that house, if he was just looking for any open door, or if Bella and I were just faceless figures in the middle of his confused state of mind. Story 5. Tom and I started our YouTube channel, American City Explorers, about 6 months ago. During that time, we explored the entire western side of Pennsylvania, filming old abandoned factories in Aliquippa, rusted-out steel mill skeletons near Pittsburgh, and decaying houses we discovered hidden along remote rural roads. Our followers loved the mystery surrounding these forgotten places, and we genuinely enjoyed the thrill of exploring and uncovering them. When we heard rumors about an old abandoned elementary school in a small town called Maplewood, just a short drive north of the city, we immediately knew we had to check it out. The old school, once known as Roosevelt Elementary, sat just outside the town, next to a set of railroad tracks that hadn't been used in decades. The paint on the walls was peeling off in large chunks. The windows were shattered, and the brick walls were covered in graffiti. Locals claimed the building was haunted, especially after dark. Some swore they'd seen lights flickering inside when no one was around, while others said they'd heard footsteps echoing through the empty halls. Almost everyone in town avoided the place, but for our channel, it was the perfect spot to shoot a creepy exploration video. On a crisp fall afternoon, we parked the car on a quiet street, away from the school's main entrance. The November breeze made dry leaves crackle along the pavement. We prepped our camera gear, double-checked the batteries, and made our way toward the fence surrounding the property. At the top was barbed wire, but someone had cut a hole in one corner, just wide enough to squeeze through. I remember pausing there for a moment, heart pounding. Something about the building made me uneasy. The silence around it felt too heavy, almost like the school itself was holding its breath. Tom, on the other hand, seemed excited. He was always the braver one. He gave me a thumbs up, so I took a deep breath and followed him. We carefully slipped through the opening in the fence and walked toward the main entrance. The front doors were boarded up, but one of the wooden panels was partially loose, leaving a gap just big enough to enter. As we stepped into the lobby, a stale odor hit us immediately. Mold, rotting wood, and decades of neglect. A faint beam of sunlight broke through the cracks, lighting up floating dust particles suspended in the air. I turned on my flashlight and handed the camera to Tom. "Welcome to Roosevelt Elementary," he whispered for the recording, pointing the lens down the deteriorating hallway. Our footsteps echoed as we moved forward, boots crunching over broken glass and debris scattered everywhere. Along the corridor were old lockers, their metal doors rusted and warped. Some stood open, revealing crumpled papers, worn-out books, and even a pair of abandoned sneakers. On one wall, we found a faded mural showing smiling children playing beneath a bright cartoon sun, but the paint had peeled and patches of black mold covered parts of their faces. I felt an odd tightness in my chest as I looked at those half-erased smiles. It felt like stepping into a forgotten part of the past, both fascinating and unsettling. After checking out a few classrooms, we came across the main office, its door half open, and decided to go inside. The floor was littered with broken computer monitors, tangled cords, and a toppled filing cabinet that had spilled papers across a grimy old carpet. Tom sifted through some of the documents and found a student and teacher roster from the late 90s, with class schedules and phone numbers. We snapped photos of the paperwork while continuing to film. Our subscribers loved seeing old documents that gave a personal touch to these abandoned places. Suddenly, a sharp noise broke the silence, a loud thump coming from somewhere further down the hallway. I froze, heart racing. Tom turned the camera toward the sound, but we saw nothing, just darkness. A chill ran down my spine. Maybe it was a door blown by the wind, I thought, though the air inside was still and stagnant. "We should check it out," Tom said, summoning his usual courage. We slowly returned to the hallway. The ceiling lights had long since died, leaving everything in shadow. Our flashlights wobbled across the peeling walls, and each step echoed eerily on the old linoleum. Then from around the corner came another sound, this time like something being dragged across the floor. My stomach tightened in fear. As we rounded the corner, we saw a faint glow coming from one of the classrooms at the end of the hallway. Tom raised his eyebrows at me, and we carefully approached the door, camera still recording. Inside the classroom stood a man, illuminated by either a small flashlight or lamp. He had his back to us, hunched shoulders, wearing a dirty jacket, ripped jeans, and messy hair. At first, I thought he might be a homeless person using the school for shelter, but something about his posture felt wrong, unnaturally rigid. Tom stepped forward a little and cleared his throat softly to announce our presence. The man turned around slowly. His eyes were wide and unfocused, as if he were seeing something none of us could. There was a tense silence, until his face twisted into a strange, unsettling grin that made my skin crawl. He began walking toward us, slowly but deliberately. Panic took over. Tom backed away quickly, his hands shaking as he held the camera. I tried to speak, but the fear clogged my throat. We both turned and ran, bolting down the hallway. Behind us, we could clearly hear him chasing us, his footsteps pounding hard on the linoleum floor. We burst out the front door, stumbling and nearly falling over each other. Outside, the light was fading, and the air had grown colder. We sprinted toward the fence, slipping through the opening. As I passed, the barbed wire scratched my arm, but I didn't stop. We kept running until we reached the car. We jumped in, slammed the doors shut, and I started the engine with trembling hands. Tom glanced back, but I refused to. I just wanted to get as far away from that man and that place as possible. For days afterward, we couldn't sleep properly. Eventually, we edited and uploaded a shortened version of the video, leaving out the most terrifying parts. We titled it Nightmare in an Abandoned Pennsylvania School, and it became one of our most watched videos. Local authorities later increased security around the building and eventually decided to demolish it. When the old walls finally came down in front of us, instead of feeling relief, we felt the memory burn even brighter, like a nightmare that refuses to fade, even after you wake up. Story 6. 2 years ago, on a February night in Lamar County, Colorado, I was driving to a nightclub where I planned to meet up with some friends for a night of fun, because Saturdays, as we used to say, were for the boys. We got together almost every Saturday unless someone had other plans. While I really enjoyed those nights, sometimes I felt a bit of pressure to show up. That particular Saturday, I had spent most of the day at my grandparents' house, which was close to my home. After enjoying a pleasant day with them, I returned home, took a quick shower, dressed nicely, put on formal shoes, grabbed my phone, wallet, and keys, and headed out. I got into my SUV, started the engine, and began driving my usual route, never imagining it would be the last time I ever drove a vehicle. Just 5 minutes from my house was the nearest highway, so I was soon cruising at about 70 miles per hour, going with the flow of traffic. After driving for about 15 or 20 minutes, I noticed a police vehicle parked on the opposite side of the highway, stationed in the left lane. My first thought was that the officer was waiting to catch speeding cars. I wish that had been the case, but unfortunately it wasn't. Driving an SUV, I had limited visibility of the ground directly in front of me. On top of that, it was nighttime, and occasionally the headlights of oncoming traffic briefly blinded me. I kept driving at the same speed, listening to music, my mind distracted by the plans I had for the night. Then suddenly I felt a violent impact underneath my vehicle. My heart sank instantly as I realized I had hit something large, possibly a person. My hands began to shake and I quickly pulled over to the shoulder of the highway, turning on my hazard lights. As soon as I came to a complete stop, panic and dread overwhelmed me. I broke down crying, my body trembling uncontrollably. I knew I had to act fast, but I also realized I couldn't return to the scene due to the danger of driving the opposite way on the highway. With trembling fingers, I dialed 911, desperate and terrified. The operator calmly informed me that they were already aware of the situation, as an officer on the scene had just reported it. I asked if I should head to the police station, and she told me yes, that it would be the right thing to do. My mind was racing and my heart pounded painfully as I tried to gather myself and drive slowly and carefully to the police station. There I filled out forms, wrote statements, and spoke briefly with an officer who assured me they would be in touch in the days to come. When I left the station, I saw multiple missed calls and texts on my phone, my friends wondering where I was. Still feeling sick, I called my friend Bob to explain what had happened and told him I wouldn't be going to the club. He was shocked and concerned, but completely understanding. He urged me to take care of myself first. When I finally got home, I collapsed into bed, physically and emotionally exhausted. I fell asleep the moment my head hit the pillow. In the following week, through news reports and police interviews, I learned more about the person I had struck. His name was Brent Thompson. He was 28 years old and had a history of minor legal issues. Brent had been pulled over by Officer Lorenzo Lujan for an expired registration tag. In a panic, Brent gave the officer a fake name, and when the lie was discovered, he tried to run. Officer Lujan chased Brent to the edge of the highway and used his taser on him. Brent fell onto the pavement just seconds before I drove by, and I tragically hit him. Brent died at the scene, and the devastating reality of what had happened affected many people. His grieving family filed a lawsuit against the officer and the police department. After a thorough investigation, the district attorney concluded that the officer's actions were lawful. Neither he nor I was charged or fined, but the weight of the tragedy haunted me every single day. In the weeks and months following the accident, my life changed dramatically. I became withdrawn and started avoiding my friends. Even though they understood my situation, I felt guilty for pulling away. I found it impossible to drive again. Every time I approached the driver's seat, I was overcome with sickness and anxiety until I eventually gave up trying. My friends and family started giving me rides, or I would rely on Uber or buses when they weren't available. I decided to start therapy to talk about the guilt and trauma. The sessions helped me process the experience, although they never erased the memories. The images, sounds, and sensations returned vividly at night, triggering recurring nightmares that often left me drenched in sweat. Eventually, I made the incredibly difficult decision to meet with Brent's family. I sat down with his parents and younger sister to explain everything I remembered about that night. I offered them my most heartfelt emotional apologies. With tears in their eyes, they forgave me. They acknowledged that Brent had made mistakes that contributed to what happened, but that didn't lessen the pain of losing him. That meeting became a turning point in my healing process. It lifted a piece of the weight I had been carrying, knowing that his family didn't blame me. Slowly, I began rebuilding my life, strengthening my relationships with family and friends, and developing a deeper appreciation for the fragility of life. I started volunteering at local community centers, giving talks to teenagers about choices, consequences, and responsibility, hoping to prevent similar tragedies. Still, I couldn't bring myself to drive. I chose to move closer to my job at a small customer service office to reduce the need for transportation. I found an apartment near a bus stop and a convenience store, simplifying my daily routine. There were times I felt isolated or frustrated for not being able to overcome the trauma, but my friends understood and respected my decision. Over time, the topic faded into the background. The experience profoundly changed my outlook. I learned that every day is a gift, and I came to value forgiveness, compassion, and gratitude more than ever before. But the sadness and regret never completely left me. A year later, I returned to the site of the accident with flowers, remembering Brent with sorrow, but also with hope. There, as the distant sound of cars filled the air, I reflected on everything I'd been through: trauma, guilt, forgiveness, and finally healing. Life is not always fair or predictable, something I learned in the hardest way possible. Brent Thompson remains forever in my thoughts, a constant reminder of how fragile life is and how quickly everything can change. Story 7. This happened to me when I was in 7th grade back in 2016, while I was living in New York City. At the time, I had a math teacher named Miss Andre. Honestly, she wasn't exactly my favorite teacher. I always felt like she wasn't very kind to me or my class, and she constantly gave us excessive amounts of homework, assignments that seemed more appropriate for advanced college students. But let's get straight to the point of this story. It was a Friday after school, right before a week-long break for President's Day. I was heading home on the school bus, the same one I took every day. As we got about halfway home, the bus stopped at a red light. While waiting for it to turn green, I noticed something strange out the window, listening to music through my earbuds. To my left, outside the bus, was Miss Andre, staring directly at me with a stiff, serious expression, which made me feel extremely uncomfortable. For a second, I wondered if she was following me, but that seemed unlikely. It was probably just a coincidence. The glass was a bit tinted, so maybe she wasn't even sure it was me inside. A moment later, the light turned to green and the bus kept moving. It felt odd to see someone from school out in the city, especially in a place as crowded as New York. When I got home, I tried to forget the whole thing. The next night, my family and I went with my cousins to a Muse concert in New Jersey. During the show, something even more disturbing happened. Suddenly, Miss Andre appeared again. This time, she was standing on the stage at the Prudential Center, staring at me with the same serious expression from the day before. Her appearance was so abrupt it was like she came out of nowhere. It had to be a hallucination, because if it were real, the entire crowd would have seen her, and security would have removed her from the stage immediately. Once I realized it probably wasn't real, I felt a little calmer and tried to ignore the vision so I could enjoy the rest of the concert. Soon after, the image of my teacher vanished again. Miss Andre didn't show up again until the following Friday. That day, my family decided to spend the weekend hiking at Mount Greylock. About 40 minutes into the hike, she appeared once more. By this point, I wasn't even scared anymore. I was just annoyed because I had no idea how to get rid of this persistent hallucination. I thought for a moment and came up with an idea. I ran directly toward where she was standing, but the moment I reached the spot, she vanished instantly, like she was swept away by the wind. My family looked at me, clearly confused, like they thought I was on something. My mom asked if I was okay, and I quickly made up an excuse, saying I just needed to burn off some energy. She replied with a simple, "Okay," but kept a confused look on her face. I didn't want to tell them what I was seeing. I felt too embarrassed and figured they wouldn't believe me anyway. We continued the hike until we reached the summit. That night we camped on the mountain, and the next evening my parents rented a fairly large Airbnb where I had my own room. The next day around 11 p.m. I fell asleep and had a nightmare involving Miss Andre. In the dream I was back at school after the President's Day break, and Miss Andre was ordering the entire math class to kill me. I was pleading with them not to do it, screaming over and over, "No." At that moment, one of my classmates pulled a pair of scissors out of their pocket and slowly began stabbing them into my heart. Just before the blades went all the way through, I woke up. When I opened my eyes, Miss Andre was just inches from my face, laughing and screaming hysterically, with a furious expression that made it seem like she wanted to kill me. I started screaming and crying desperately, calling for my parents at the top of my lungs. My parents rushed into the room, worried and asking what had happened. I couldn't hide it anymore. I told them everything I'd experienced over the past week. I explained in detail the first time I saw her outside the school bus, the concert incident, the hiking trip, and the nightmare I had just woken from. They both looked really scared and deeply concerned. My dad, visibly shaken, asked why I hadn't told them earlier. I told him I was afraid they wouldn't believe me and would think I was just making things up. My mom, trying to comfort me, said I could sleep in their room that night to help me feel safer. That night I did sleep in their room, and I felt a bit more secure. The next morning while driving home, we had a long talk about the possibility of me not going back to the same school because of everything that had happened. I was convinced that if I returned, the hallucinations would continue, and I wanted to switch schools immediately. My parents were hesitant and told me they'd make a decision later that evening, but they did say that regardless of their choice, I didn't have to go back to school the next day. That same night, my parents told me I could transfer to another school on the condition that I agreed to see a psychologist once a week. I didn't hesitate. "No problem," I said. When I started attending the new school, my friends kept messaging me on social media and asking why I left. I made up a story, telling them my parents wanted me to go to a more prestigious school. Surprisingly, everyone believed it. The real reason stayed between my family, my psychologist, and me. Speaking of the psychologist, during the sessions I was able to talk about everything, including the hallucinations involving Miss Andre. It helped me a lot. The psychologist eventually prescribed some medication that stopped the visions. Thanks to that, I never saw Miss Andre again, and I haven't had any other hallucinations since. To this day, I still wonder what exactly caused such a vivid and specific hallucination. I guess I'll never know. Story 8. A few years ago, I worked in private security in Buffalo, New York. This past October, the agency assigned me to guard an old half-burned mansion on the outskirts of the city. The place had caught fire years ago, and according to local stories, a couple of people had died inside. Since then, the property had been abandoned, a charred structure with broken windows and a crooked roof. Local teens liked to spread ghost stories about it, but I didn't believe in that stuff. To me, it was just another night shift. The property sat on a large piece of land, surrounded by a tall iron fence. My job was to patrol the area several times a night to make sure no vandals or intruders got inside. The first few nights were uneventful. I just walked in circles with my flashlight, listening to the wind blowing through the dry trees. But a week into the assignment, around 2 in the morning, something strange happened. That night was colder than usual, cold enough that I could see my breath in the air. I stopped near the front gate, watching the upper windows of the mansion. Suddenly, I heard a distant sound, a high-pitched scream that lasted about 3 seconds before cutting off abruptly. At first, I thought it might have been an animal, but something about the tone and urgency of that scream felt too human. I pointed my flashlight toward the house, but from where I was, I didn't see anything unusual. I had the impulse to go inside and check, but I had been given strict instructions not to enter the building alone due to structural dangers. My supervisor had made it very clear, in case of any suspicious activity, call the police. So I stayed outside, increasingly uneasy, until sunrise. By then, I managed to convince myself it had probably just been a stray cat or the wind playing tricks. Over the following days, I couldn't get that scream out of my head. Each night, without realizing it, I walked a little closer to the entrance, listening more carefully. Then on Wednesday, something happened that chilled me to the bone. While patrolling the back of the property, I looked up at the top floor and noticed a faint light flickering behind soot-covered windows. It looked like someone was walking with a flashlight, an impossible sight since the building had no electricity, and the upper floors were completely destroyed in the fire. I stood frozen, staring at the light as it moved slowly. Then I saw the silhouette of a person. They were moving slowly, swaying slightly before disappearing from view. A knot formed in my stomach. It was 1:30 a.m. and that place was supposed to be empty. This time, curiosity got the better of me. I radioed into Central Dispatch, letting them know I was going in to investigate. I carefully climbed the creaking steps to the porch and pushed open the front door. The inside smelled of ash and damp wood. My flashlight scanned across scorched walls, warped floorboards, and piles of debris. Every step echoed through the darkness as I slowly moved through the burnt-out rooms, coughing from the dust in the air. Then I heard a faint whisper behind me. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and I quickly swung my flashlight around. Nothing. Just a shredded curtain swaying beside a broken window. Trying to stay calm, I pushed deeper into the mansion. That's when I felt it, a presence behind me, as if someone was standing just outside my reach. I spun around, hands shaking. Standing there was a man dressed in a white robe, similar to a hospital gown. It was dirty, worn out, and hung loosely over his thin body. His face was partly hidden in shadow, but I could clearly see the whites of his eyes. My instincts kicked in, and I ran. I nearly crashed into the hallway walls as I bolted for the exit. I don't even remember breathing, just the deafening sound of my heartbeat. The front door was still ajar, and I burst through it, nearly falling down the porch steps. Outside, I fumbled for my phone with trembling hands and called the police. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, convinced the man would appear in the doorway at any second, but he never did. The police arrived with several patrol cars. The officers seemed skeptical as I explained what had happened, like they'd heard similar stories before. Still, they agreed to return with me for a full search at sunrise. I entered with them, led by a veteran detective named Callahan, who seemed more patient and open-minded than the others. We searched the rooms I had passed through, but didn't find anything unusual right away. After several hours of combing the place, one of the officers discovered a hidden door behind a collapsed bookshelf. It led to the basement, down a staircase that looked much newer, possibly reinforced. The stench wafting up from the basement was intense enough to sting our eyes. A sickening blend of mold, moisture, and something else I couldn't quite identify. When we went down, we found 3 men alive, clearly startled by our arrival. These individuals were wanted in connection with a series of robberies in the area. One of them tried to attack the officers but was quickly subdued. In one corner sat another man, tied to a chair, gagged and visibly beaten. His arms were bruised and his face looked hollow and battered. Then it hit me. The scream I had heard that first night must have come from him. While I had been patrolling outside, he had been trapped in that basement begging for help. The police arrested the 3 men and freed the hostage. As they led the suspects out, I noticed none of them wore a white gown. They were all dressed in jeans and sweatshirts. I asked Detective Callahan if there might have been another accomplice who got away. He couldn't say for sure. One of the suspects admitted they used the abandoned mansion as a hideout, but didn't mention anyone in a hospital gown. Even now, I still think about the moment I turned and saw that figure. Was it the hostage wearing something improvised? Did I misinterpret what I saw in the dark? Or was someone else there? Someone who didn't want to be found? I don't think I'll ever get a clear answer. Now, every time I drive past that mansion, which is still surrounded by yellow tape, I vividly remember those eyes watching me in the dark, and I wonder if the real story of what happened in that place goes far deeper than anyone will ever know. Story 9. This happened to me when I was 18, during a road trip I took with my parents and a friend, whom I'll call Anna. The story took place in Sweden while we were on a long car journey. The plan was to drive about 8 hours from home to visit a theme park and spend the night at a nearby campground, although we hadn't made any reservations yet. The day finally arrived, and after a long drive, we reached the city where the park was located, even though we wouldn't be visiting until the next day. That meant we had to sleep that night in the tents we brought in the car. My dad searched online for a nearby campsite, and we found one that looked pretty good. However, when he called, they told us there was a large soccer tournament happening that day, and all spots were fully booked. Advance reservations had been required. My dad called several other nearby campsites, but none had space available, or their prices were outrageous. In the end, our only option was to find a place to camp in the wilderness. We set the GPS to take us to the nearest parking lot inside a nature reserve, so we could avoid parking fines. When we arrived at the spot indicated by the GPS, we saw a few people still around and asked if it was a good place to pitch our tents for the night. A woman who was out hiking assured us it was a peaceful area and there weren't any parking patrols. So we decided to camp in that small, remote gravel parking lot, completely surrounded by forest and about a 10-minute walk from a nearby beach. At first, we thought the beach would be a nice spot to sleep, but something inside me suggested it would be safer to stay in the parking area. When we got out of the car to set up the tents, I noticed a lone car parked a bit farther away. Its poor condition caught my attention, especially since there didn't seem to be anyone nearby. By that time, most hikers and beachgoers had already left. Still, I decided not to think much of it. I helped my parents set up the tents. My parents would sleep in one, and Anna and I would stay in the other, both pitched close together. Once everything was set up, Anna and I got comfortable watching YouTube videos and snacking. Around 11 p.m., we decided to go to bed early so we wouldn't be tired the next day. After laughing and enjoying our snacks for a while, we finally decided to sleep around midnight. My parents were already fast asleep in their tent. Anna and I were scrolling through TikTok on our phones when, out of nowhere, we heard a metallic sound coming from the parking lot. It clearly sounded like a shovel being thrown onto gravel. Anna and I jumped at the noise and whispered to each other, wondering what it could have been. We stayed completely silent, too scared to peek outside. The noise had come from the exact direction of the abandoned car. Then we heard what sounded like the same shovel being thrown into the car's trunk, followed by the loud slam of the trunk closing. Moments later, we heard the car's engine start, and it sped off quickly, disappearing into the distance. Anna and I were stunned and terrified. I quickly texted a friend who lived nearby to tell him where we were and what had just happened. He messaged back saying that beach was known to be dangerous, a spot where organized criminals often carried out illegal activity. My blood ran cold after reading that. About 10 minutes after the car had sped away, Anna and I were just starting to calm down when we suddenly heard the loudest, most terrifying scream I've ever heard. It clearly came from a man. Horrified, I immediately texted my mom to tell her about the scream. When she didn't reply, I decided to call her to wake her up. Neither of my parents had heard the scream. They were still sleeping. My mom tried to reassure us, saying it probably wasn't anything serious. But I was too terrified to imagine any normal situation that would explain a scream like that. Anna and I huddled under our blankets, filled with fear and uncertainty about what might happen next. Even though it was around midnight and we were exhausted, we couldn't sleep. The scream, the memory of the car speeding off, and the tension in the air kept us wide awake. Everything was silent, until we heard footsteps outside our tents, slow, cautious, and deliberate. Anna and I froze in fear. I immediately turned off my phone to hide the light from the screen. My heart was pounding. and I couldn't come up with any logical reason for someone to be walking around our tents in the middle of the forest. We stayed absolutely still and silent, listening as the person circled our tent, then my parents' tent, and finally walked around our car. The person paused in front of our tents for a few moments. Then we heard the same car from earlier returning. Its headlights lit up our tents, and Anna and I quickly lay down flat, pretending to be asleep. I gathered enough courage to peek through the small window just as the car door slammed shut and the vehicle sped off again. About 5 minutes later, we heard another car approaching rapidly. Looking outside, I saw it was a police car, racing in the same direction the earlier vehicle had gone. After that, nothing else happened. Even though things seemed to have settled down, Anna and I were still so nervous that we decided to hide out in our car with the doors locked, hoping to feel safer. I stayed awake watching the dark forest until nearly 5 in the morning. Anna, exhausted, fell asleep in the passenger seat beside me. An hour later, we returned to the tent and finally fell asleep from sheer exhaustion. When we woke up around 9 a.m., we were still deeply shaken by what had happened. I told my mom everything in detail, and she admitted that she too had heard footsteps, and that when the person was in front of their tent, she heard heavy, agitated breathing, like something out of a horror movie. My dad, on the other hand, had slept through the entire night, so we had to fill him in on everything. We immediately packed up and took down the tents, eager to leave that place as soon as possible. We spent the day at the theme park, but later that night, I looked up information about the forest where we had camped. I found out that shortly before our visit, a man had been stabbed to death there over gang-related debts. On top of that, 2 men had gone missing at that same beach and were never found. To this day, I still wonder who let out that blood-curdling scream, what someone was doing with a shovel in the forest at midnight, and why the police were chasing that car. Every time I think about it, a chill runs down my spine, especially when I imagine what might have happened if the person walking around our tents had decided to act. Story 10. I'd always been fascinated by ghost stories. My friends and I loved sharing creepy tales whenever we had sleepovers. One night, we decided to take our curiosity a step further. We planned to visit the abandoned cemetery on the outskirts of our small town in western New York. Rumor had it the place was haunted by spirits dating back to the 1800s, and no one dared go there after dark. But we were young, brave, maybe a little reckless, and it sounded like fun. It was a cold October night, just days before Halloween. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in shades of purple and orange before fading into complete darkness. We hopped on our bikes and pedaled through streets lined with old Victorian-style homes. Slowly, we left behind the warm glow of the streetlights and slipped into the shadows. Eventually, we arrived at a weathered wooden sign, half covered in overgrown weeds. Oakwood Cemetery, established 1812. The lettering was so faded it was barely readable. The cold night air brushed against our faces as we left our bikes beside a gnarled oak tree. Becca turned on her phone's flashlight while Jake tried to steady his shaking hands. I felt a mix of excitement and dread bubbling in my stomach. The cemetery gate was made of wrought iron, intricately designed and rusted, and it groaned loudly as Jake pushed it open, shattering the silence. We stepped cautiously onto a path lined with tilted tombstones. Some graves bore worn-out names, nearly erased by wind and rain. Others were surprisingly well-preserved, decorated with angel carvings and ivy. The moon hung overhead like a silver lantern, casting an eerie glow across the scene. We followed the path deeper into the cemetery, passing by worn-down statues that seemed to watch us with lifeless eyes. A few yards ahead stood an old maple tree towering over a group of graves. Its twisted branches stretched like deformed arms, casting strange shadows that danced with the breeze. We tried to joke around to break the tension, but the silence was so thick it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. At the center of the cemetery stood a crumbling mausoleum. Its marble walls were cracked and dried leaves had gathered on the steps. A small plaque next to the entrance read, "In memory of the Whitaker family, 1839. Local legend claimed the Whitakers had died in a tragic fire, and their souls had never found peace. We glanced at each other nervously. Supposedly, that was the most haunted spot in the entire cemetery. Curiosity got the better of us, and with hesitant steps we approached the mausoleum. Becca led the way, lighting the path with her phone. The heavy door was slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness inside. The air smelled like damp stone and something sweet and rotting, like funeral flowers long forgotten. We pushed the door open a bit more and stepped inside, hearts pounding. The air felt heavier, as if we had crossed into another world, older and denser. Our flashlights illuminated moss-covered walls and cracked marble slabs where coffins had likely once rested. Cobwebs hung from the corners, shifting slightly with our every move. Then Jake froze. His light was fixed on a still figure in the far corner. It wore a long, tattered white garment. Fear surged through me as my pulse thundered in my ears. The figure had a hood or a veil that completely hid its face. No one dared move or breathe. Suddenly, the figure raised its head, and two dull glowing eyes reflected our flashlights. A raspy sound, like a faint moan, broke the silence. "Run," Becca whispered with a trembling voice. We bolted. We shoved the door open as the figure took a slow step toward us. I nearly tripped over a broken headstone as I rushed out, my heart slamming in my chest. The cold night air hit my face, but I barely felt it. We sprinted down the same path we had entered, our flashlights bouncing wildly over tombstones. Tree branches clawed at our arms as we passed the old maple. I felt something following us. Whether it was real or just my fear, I didn't know. The gravestones blurred into a dark mass, and for a moment I held my breath, half expecting a ghostly hand to grab my shoulder. Finally, the rusted gate came into view. We flung it open and dashed toward the road, collapsing next to our bikes. My lungs burned and I couldn't find the words to speak. Jake's face was pale, and Becca's wide, terrified eyes were fixed on the cemetery gate. None of us dared to look back. With trembling hands, we climbed onto our bikes and pedaled as fast as we could. We didn't stop until the warm streetlights and distant hum of traffic surrounded us again. That city noise, normally so unremarkable, felt strangely comforting. When we finally caught our breath and could speak, we all asked the same question. What did we just see in there? No one had a clear answer. All we knew for certain was that the hooded figure, those glowing eyes, and the suffocating presence in that mausoleum were unlike anything we had ever experienced.